And good afternoon to everyone. It's quite a pleasure, and I'm so happy to be among you. This is a very interesting discussion, thanks to the University of Turin and Professor Giovanni Filizzo, who was quite, I know that did a hard work to organize things and bring all this together. Well, I think many of you follow the news for sure and the events that are taking place these days. You know that there are a lot of events taking place that involves the policies that Iran takes and decisions that are made in Tehran and the impact that it will have on broader dynamics, not just in the Middle East but also in Europe. You know, well, probably at least in the last year since the war in Ukraine, you have heard the name of Iran many times over the provision of drones to Russia, its support to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now, well, with the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, again, well, Iran is an important actor as it is taking a side, at least in favor of, obviously, Palestinians and trying to provide also military and security support. So, also there was years that nuclear discussion was the center of Iranian politics and European politics. Well, we know all of these issues probably, you heard a lot about them in the news and elsewhere. So what I will do today, I would like to somehow go a bit deeper and not just get into the actual policy issues that we are very much dealing these days on the surface, because I know that you're in the audience that would like to understand things from a more deeper perspective, and at least you're here with this mission. So also that's a good news, and I take it as a granted to go more into a better, profound understanding of the dynamics of Europe and Iran relationship and how that is changing, how that is probably be in the future, and how probably we can, as people who will have influence or already have influence, shape this dynamic. So let me start by saying that, well, probably the relation between Iran and Europe is one of the oldest cases of diplomacy and international relation, not of course in a modern sense, but in an ancient time. You know, this relation is not at all new. It goes back to at least 500 centuries before the Christ, when the Persians' intervention, the Greek, at that time, city-states, made a lot of events that some of them you may know, like the Peloponnesian War, like the famous Sparta and Athens War. So basically you have a sort of Iran-Europe dynamic at least 2,500 years. So we are talking about a very long and complex story. This dynamic later continued in the ancient time by the Persians and the Romans. We're in Italy, and the Roman Empire in broad term had immense cultural, trade, and also war relations with Iran. So basically, the sort of less complex relations of Iran and Greek further evolved into more complex Roman and Persian relations. It was almost for a millennium that this relation was somehow less important due to, of course, the events in Europe and also invasion of Iran by the Muslim Arab and the emergence of the Caliphate. But then the emergence of the Iranian state and the Persian state and re-emergence of Europe from the 16th century made it again a very dynamic and important aspect of the relation. So you still, in the modern context, you have this relation shaped from the 1507, which is the first time that the European powers, at that time Portugal, entered to the Persian Gulf and invaded the Hormuz Island, which was an Iranian and Persian island. So this is a new era of the relation. So a lot of complexities, as you can imagine, over these years and hundreds and thousands of years of story, that makes it not an easy job to understand and to try to go deeper into Iran-EU relation. The relation is not as simple as we may immediately try to perceive through the media or through the general public perception. So there are very deep layers of arguments here. The two sides historically have shown that they are quite important for each other. For Europe, Iran is important, basically because Iran is a neighbor of Europe. Basically, Iran is part of the European neighborhood, so it impacts whatever happens in the European security architecture and in European, and many of European interests that are taking place. So basically for Europe, it's always costly to not go and manage its relation with Iran. For Iran, on the other hand, there's a similar dynamic. Well, I just put aside the impact of the oil, the trade, and so on, and the Europe and Iran relation, which I will get back to it in a few minutes. For Iran also, the relation is quite pivotal and strategic and significant for various reasons, because for many years Iran was viewing Europe as a place to bring technology, capital, and investment, and also because Europe has an important political weight and normative power that makes it impossible for Iranian political establishment to make politics at international level without considering the European dynamics. So what here means is that we have a very beginning of the discussion that we are facing with two sides that are strategic in one way or another for each other. They impact each other's interests and they can create threat for each other. So knowing this fact, what I want to discuss today is about several things. First, I wanted to go a bit deeper into breaking down the arguments, or let's say the factors that are shaping Iranian perception of Europe. And then we will try to see with each other how probably this perception is leading to some sort of policies that we are seeing today. And then hopefully, if we have some time, I know that it was on the title of this argument, How to Make Europe Relevant, but hopefully we will also argue it on some policy level. My personal immediate preference is that we go more to the deeper arguments that you may not necessarily hear it outside this environment, so in order to break down the complexities and the difficulties of understanding this relationship. So saying that, let me start by saying that when I say about perception of Europe by Iranian side, what exactly I mean? I mean what we basically refer when we talk about the concept of perception. So when I talk about the perception, I'm talking about two important factors. The first is that the image. Is the image that, I mean, each of us, when there is a word, when there is a concept that is named, you immediately bring it equal to a sort of image. And that image is critical when it comes to political international relation sense, because that image is the context and at the basis of many decisions. It's not directly involved in decisions, but it is the context that decisions are taken. So when we talk about a perception, we're talking about the image that exists on the other side about one actor. When we talk about a perception, the second factor that I mean by this perception is about the strategic assessment and meaning that emerges out of these assessments. Let me give you an example, because this may be a more conceptual argument. So imagine that I'm a military and you're moving, so I'm coming from a military background, that's why my examples are more on security and military terms and not so much soft things. I apologize for that. But, well, imagine you're something that many times we call about misperception. Imagine you're country A and you're moving your missiles, or you're moving your part of your military forces. It becomes a matter of a question that what your enemy interprets you. I mean, how your enemy sees you. So here comes the group of actors inside the state, which includes intelligence, includes the policymakers, includes everyone who's involved in the decision-making cycle, to do an assessment of that event. So how that event is perceived in the mind of the people. Is it a threat? Is it not a threat? Is it something, normal movement? That part is called perception. So basically, perception is not in this term, it's a product of assessments that you do. It's not a decision still. It's not still an area that you may call it a policy. It's not there yet. We're still talking about the phases before taking a decision, phases before taking a policy. So when I talk about perception today, I mean these two concepts. The image that each of us have, so image that the Iranian side of Europe, and the assessment or the strategic assessment that the Iran usually can take from different European behaviors or actions. So let's remember that because, as I was trying to tell you, that this relation is very historical in the long term, probably you're not just talking about a political argument here. You are talking about a cultural dynamic, you're talking about a human aspect, you're talking about cultural, you're talking about also military and security-wise, so it's multidisciplinary. Basically, the perception between Iran and Europe, another characteristic of that is that it's very much multidisciplinary, it's very much multi-layered. That's why I call it a multi-layered perception of Iran of Europe. And this multi-layered nature of this perception, remember, always makes the job difficult. Because if you have multi-layers, you necessarily, remember, in international politics, whenever things become multi-layers and various layers, they become complex, they become difficult to simplify them over one concept. For example, you cannot say that there is animosity between Iran and Europe at this moment. You go to the news, you hear that the European politicians said this about Iran. You go to the news, you say that the Iranian leaders said that we are going to do this. Does that mean that there is a sort of animosity there? So today we're trying to understand, is it yes or no? The argument is that when you're facing with complexity, which is in this case, there is a very multi-layered, complex relation, you have different meanings, which sometimes these different meanings and perception are contradictory. And that's, as we go further, you will realize that many of the Iranian perceptions are contradicting with each other. So basically, you have a mix of the perceptions, that these perceptions are not in any way shaping or forming a unified understanding of the other. So what I'm arguing with you here in this big conceptual argument is that it's very difficult in international relation to argue about a unified perception of the other. This perception, especially when the relation is very much deep-rooted in history, very much deep-rooted in multifactorial dimensions, becomes paradoxical, in contradiction with itself, and as a result makes the job of the policymakers very difficult to interpret the other side. And one consequence that sometimes you may hear is miscalculation. In this environment, you may find a lot of miscalculation because policymakers, as we are all human and we are policymakers, we cannot understand these complexities easily. So this was a concept, broad concept that I will try to show to you by going deeper into saying that what this perception is. So when I tell you multi-layered, at least I think there are 4 layers in Iran-EU relations or Europe relation. Well, first layer is a sort of a social and intellectual perception of Europe. So let's remember that at least in the modern term, Europe was very much perceived by Iranians, at least from the 18th century, by the developments of the political thought in Europe. That means basically the concept of modernity, the change in the perception of the nature, science, and rationalism. So this rationalism movement and the argument of modernity very much influenced the Iranian understanding of Europe. Many Iranian intellectuals started to actually pick up many of the concepts which were shaped in Europe, like the concept of freedom, like the law, like the constitution, like the separation of power, like having an absolute power. So these are the political thought concepts emerged from the 18th and 19th century developments in Europe that immediately, with some years, maybe few decades just, maybe with 5, 10, or maximum 20 years delays, arrived in Iran and were translated and had huge impacts on Iranian political thoughts. So basically, probably you may argue that Iran, Turkey, and Egypt are the three major importers of these European political thoughts in the Middle East. They were the pioneering three countries that they started to adapt these concepts and to try to reform their own political establishment. So basically what we are seeing here is a movement of a reform in Iran which is originated by European thoughts and rationalism and development on the concept of modernity. So the idea of progress, for example, came into the discussion in Iran and was heavily studied, translated, and impacted. So three big impacts. One was the formation of a constitutional revolution in Iran, which is about 1905 and until 1911, which is directly influenced by these political thoughts from, let's say, imported from Europe. And then, even before that, you have more technological impact of Europe. As we know, this concept of modernity is not just at the level of political thought. It started with the industry, the new age of the industrial revolution in Europe, and so forth. So these impacts were immediately perceived by Iranians after when they defeated the second round of the Russo-Iranian War, which took place in 1813 and 1828, which Iran actually lost many of these provinces in the north to Russia. So that losses of the land hugely impacted Iranian understanding of the world. They started to look outside. They started to understand what was the reason of these failures and the defeats. And what they found interesting was the technological revolution in Europe. So they tried to import also the technology, which was initially from military technology, then the medicine, chemistry, material, and other things, in order to resolve this sort of weakness that they were seeing in preventing Russian more attacks toward their northern borders. So you will see two ways of initial intellectual impact of Europe on Iran, which is basically started from the 17th century, 18th century, and is extended till now. So what this impact is that basically you have a group of Iranian intellectuals who are trying to reform the traditions inside Iran. They try to reform the political establishment inside Iran, and they are trying to reform, let's say, the system of governance in Iran based on European thought. So we put aside this, and then I will conclude that how this impacted the whole Persian, let's say, perception of Europe. The second strand of the thought, or a way of influence of Europe on Iran, was basically more or less was coming out of this dimension, of the previous dimension which I was saying, which is basically about a first group of Iranian migrants or Iranian students who came to Europe at least from 1828, immediately after the defeat of Iran by Russia in that war. And the Treaty of Golestan and Turkmenchai, which Iran lost the land, as I said. So the Iranian kingdom started to send students to go and study in Europe and see what is going on in the world. So what we should learn, basically. So these students, which were part of the elite, by the way, at that time, when they returned back to Iran, they created that image of Europe. The image is a progress, is a more developed part of the world. It can provide you the things, it can provide you the capital, it can provide you the technology, and it can shape your future based on what they have achieved. So you continue having this sort of, let's say, social impact, which is basically, we're talking now more from an intellectual level to a social level. Continue till now. You still see a huge amount of Iranian diaspora, which are, many of them are Iranian students, coming to Europe, not necessarily with the same motives, but they are creating an image of Europe inside their own countries. So basically you have almost millions of Iranian diaspora in Europe that are one of the reference points of shaping the European image inside their own country. They're usually from a middle class, so their word is heard back in their home. what they read and write on social media or whatever else is usually followed, so they can impact the image of Europe on their countries. So then the other factor in the social dimension is the TV and radio. Let's remember that Iran is basically the first country in the Middle East that started to have its own radio and TV stations, 1925 and then 1957. So the impact and the diversification of the, let's say, broadcasting mechanisms on shaping this perception of Europe, at least goes back to 1950s. So let me conclude with this part, that when I mentioned social and intellectual impact of Europe and Iran, what sort of perceptions have caused these two factors? At least three. First is a perception of fascination. So many Iranians were fascinated by what they were seeing in Europe. There are books written by Iranian students from 1850s onward. As I was telling you, they were the first group of elites coming and seeing the countries outside, which shows this fascination. And this fascination continues. So there's an ongoing and persistent concept of fascination by Europe. This fascination is, as I mentioned, is caused by European progressive thoughts, which is still basically Europe on some areas has a progressive thoughts, on Europe's technological, economic, and trade power, and economic power in general, as we say. And basically, this perception is very much positive, as we can imagine. It's fascination, so it's obviously positive. And it asks for change. So this perception of Europe, this impact, is a force of a change. So Europe, for those people who are fascinated by the concept of Europe, is a driver for a change, is a driver for reviewing their own country's way of governance, their own country's way of life for people, based on the European experience. So this is one strand which exists. The second is the perception of dominance and threats. It's interesting, it's completely opposite the other one. So remember that when we were talking about the societies, and especially a society like Iran, which at least right now is around 90 million, and even before it was always one of the most populated countries in the region, and an intellectually vibrant and dynamic society, you had always different groups of thinkers and groups of intellectuals which were not necessarily thinking the same way. So that's the core of the issue. So you have a group of elites, which basically could be religious elites, even could be nationalists, who believe that that much fascination of Europe is not a good thing, is causing a domination. It is causing, actually, the forgiving of whatever traditions we had, either religious tradition or Persian tradition of the ancient time. So there is a fear of the losing of whatever you had as the civilization, which is a Persian civilization, in the mind of those nationalists, and in the mind of course, even the religious clerics, that this fear of the losing a civilizational character is causing a sort of viewing Europe as a civilizational threat. So when I argue about this second perception, so as I said, one perception of fascination, one perception of threat and civilizational, let's say, threat, each of these have their own supporters inside the country, which usually are in a clash, and usually are in a sort of different way of a clash, even in a political way or in an intellectual way. And then there is one point which I probably forgot to mention in my previous point on the social dynamic, and that is the fact of a very long cultural link that exists between Iran and Persia. It is very interesting. Maybe there are only two countries which right now both of them have a very difficult relation with Europe. One is Russia and one is Iran. And when you go at a social level and you start asking them, so do you feel more like the people around your region, or how do you feel? Probably many of them respond, I feel more European. So there is a sense of belonging. It's very interesting. Still, like in Russia, Iran, if you go to the social level, there is a huge distinction between others who are in the region, which are usually Arabs, because Iran is surrounded by the Arab countries, obviously, in itself, and those who are not Arabs, who are basically the others on the other side, on the western side, which are Europeans. So Iranians define themselves more closer to Europeans than to Arabs. So this has created a sort of, which has many factors behind this perception. It goes back to the education system, it goes back to the many dynamics which are is beyond our discussion today. But what matters here is that sense of belonging that this perception is creating. It creates a sense of a belonging. That sense of a belonging is that there's a perception that Europeans, and by the way, one of the reasons important to mention is that, as I said, there are lots of people-to-people reactions and linkages. So, which was constant movement of human being, Iranian migrants, diaspora between Iran and Europe. So this has created a sense of belonging. So, I tried to explain one layer. That was a social and intellectual layer. So we had three major perceptions. Perception of fascination, perception of threat, and perception of belonging. The second layer, however, is about trade and an economic partnership. You need to remember that one of the oldest aspects of Iran and Europe relations is their trade and economic partnership and work. They were for a long time economic partners in various ways, not always in a positive way, and I will explain why. So, putting aside the old history of the Roman-Persian interactions and coming a bit forward to a more contemporary history of, again, back to the modern history of the 16th and 17th century, maybe from 17th century, more or less, you see a new round of trade partnership between Iran and Europe. And that starts with the Portuguese, Dutch, British, and then French trade with Iran. And we need to remember that this is quite an important area because, again, it impacted how Iranians are thinking today. And as you will see throughout my argument is that many of my arguments are going back historically because you should not forget that history for Iranians is alive. History is not something in the book. When you go to the context of Iran, history is something of today. History exists, history alives, history shapes your current, and history shapes your future. So whenever you talk about the argument in Iran, it's become very simplistic if you don't go back to the historical layers. That's why today you will hear a lot from me about it. Whenever I want to discuss, I go back a bit more. I go back to the deeper, because otherwise you don't get the minds of the people who are discussing. So, back to our argument of the trade. This new round of the trade started by the 17th century, as you can probably imagine, is very much influenced by Europeans' mercantilist and colonialist approach to the trade. What I mean by mercantilist, as you probably better know, is the simple concept that there is a political support and there is even sometimes a military intervention in support of a commercial activity. So when we talk about the mercantilism here, basically we mean that some of the European actors started to use their political influence or military capability as the back that needs to forego or to advance their trading interests. This has caused a lot of problem because, as you can imagine, and probably you may know, Iran was never being colonized by European countries. However, the very fine line of a sort of a colonization took place when we talk about the trade. And that's happened through mechanisms like tax, not paying of the tax with trade with Iran, tax exemptions in a broad term, and preferential trade agreements. You have all over the 18th and 19th century, especially with the British and less with the Dutch traders, who these trade agreements are very much done in a very preferential ways in favor of the European partner, or the British partner in this case. And that means exclusive trade rights, so basically the right of, for example, of the trade of a tea in the whole Iranian country was given to one person. So that one person, that one trader, which had a political link with the British kings, or a huge political support in London, were responsible for the trade of all tobacco, or all the tea inside another country. So when I talk about exclusive trade right, I mean these sorts of agreements. Or it was high rate loans. There were lots of incidents of the 19th century, at least from 1850, which Iranian government becomes bankrupt, not through any military intervention, but through giving loans, which was the loans given by the usually British investors, and again here we're talking about the private bankers, who were giving loans to the king. And the king was not able, to the Persian king, and the king was not able to return back the loan. And as a result, there were lots of history over the fact that how the national gold or the whatever backed the, and as a result, apart from the inventories of the country, the trade rights were coming as part of those way of repaying back your loan. So basically, the trade rights, the loans, and preferential trade agreements led to a situation that all the local industry or local economic capacities of Iran throughout the 19th century and early 20th century were somehow collapsed. So, having in mind this episode of the trade, which actually somehow continued throughout the 20th century, the oil trade, and as you know, which very, very infamous coup of 1953, which happened in Iran, was resulted because of the nationalism, that actually the nationalization of the oil industry in Iran, as a reaction to this preferential trade agreement with British Petroleum Company. So here we're talking about more or less a sort of policy that was adopted by one country, and here there's essentially Britain. But let's not forget that you may ask that, okay, so how we can bring the whole concept of Europe under one country's experience? That's a valid question that I will engage with that, because mostly when we talk about the image, you tend to generalization of the principles. When you tend to generalize the principles, basically you try to pick up one event as a guideline that can explain everything else throughout your experience. So the experience of what actually means, what I said, is that the experiment of a trade with Britain by most Iranian intellectuals was picked up as an experience of doing trade with the whole Europe, with the concept of Europe. So, moving a bit forward, then we have throughout the 70s, the 1972 and 1978, and before that 1962, agreements with, at that time, European community, which facilitated trade. Remember, throughout that Cold War experience, Europe was mostly not a political actor. It was more a commercial or economic actor. And that very much translated in its relation with Iran. Iran's relation with Europe throughout the 70s and 60s is more economic in nature. But you don't see that sort of mercantilism there, but it's more about normal trade. And we're talking about the period that the nationalization of oil in Iran has already taken place. So Iran is investing a lot of, is exporting a lot of oil to European countries, different European countries. So the trade volume between the two states are two blocks is quite huge. So here let me conclude by one perception that we can argue. And that's about the perception of dependency, which is an important argument in Iranian political thought. And that is a critique that generates from the argument that the relation with the Europe throughout the 18th and 19th century can be repeated, and has been repeated. And what it means that the relation with Europe is causing the collapse of domestic industry, huge loans, and dependency in the long term. So, as a result, one of the main political arguments coming out of this perception is anti-imperialism. So basically, the concept of resisting dependency, or what you will call in 1979 revolution, non-alignment policy, is somehow reflected in this perception of Europe as a partner that tries to somehow make you dependent, and as a result, try to take out whatever resources that you may control. So, just for one round, until now, because I'm entering we have 4 layers, so I explained 2 layers. And before I enter the second 2 round, if you have any questions on these 2 points, you may feel free to have, please. Okay, so it seems no, so I will continue, and maybe at the end of the discussion we will have some time for more discussion. Well, the third area, or the third layer, let's put it, is a political development. Because so far we talked less about politics. We talked about the social elites and let's say trade. But political dimension less. On the political side, however, the discussion is huge. So I try to concentrate more on the, let's say, the last 4 decades of Iran-Europe relation, because it becomes somehow impossible in such a short time. We go a bit more deeper. So let's go back to the 1979 revolution in Iran and see what has happened. I think we at least have 4 rounds or 4 periods of relation between Iran and Europe after the revolution. The first period is the 1980s, which is characterized by deep suspicion of both sides to each other. The revolution in Iran, as you know, it was a sort of anti-imperialist imperialism revolution, and the no East, no West slogan, which basically is a sort of Islamist non-alignment argument. So basically, in this perspective, Europe is considered as part of the West. And the perception of Europe as part of the West means that the relation with Europe from the Iranian perspective should have been reassessed in a huge way. So basically, the anti-imperialist approach of the Iranian revolutionists at those years led them to a sort of a hostile approach to Europe. Europe in this period is very much perceived by Iranians as the continuation of the United States, as the continuation of US policy, which was, of course, in support of the previous regime and Shah. So revolutionists were seeing the Europe as that side that has already taken a side. What I mean by that is that an actor that has taken a side, which is in favor of the previous collapsed regime. So this automatically has added to the antagonism shown by the Iranian side to the Europeans. Another dimension was that Europe was seen as a country that is supporting the regional order of the 1980s, which Iranian revolutionary forces were against that. And Europe was seen as a stabilizing force to this status quo power, to this order. So basically, Iranian revolutionists were asking that this regional order that is in the Middle East is a US-led order, which this is basically what they argue also today. However, Europe was seen more as a status quo power, so basically, again, as a continuation of the United States. And then the conflict emerged in this line too. So the conflict over the order, the conflict over the regional order, the 2 different views. On the European side, the 1980s is characterized by Europe's show of solidarity to US, which is basically a fact because of if you probably have heard of 1979-1985 hostage crisis in Iran, Europe stand with US in support of solidarity to US. And that actually increased that perception of Europe as being the side of the United States. Europe was concerned about the flow of oil throughout the 80s and the quest of Iranians to change the regional order. So the area, the perception on both sides was more or less a sort of a major mistrust, a sort of only viewing Europe as a continuation of the US power. So basically Europe, and by the way, we can argue that was somehow the same way because of the Cold War dynamic, which basically not that much allowed a European independent foreign policy making to shape. The next round of relation probably starts from 1992 to 2003. And that's a period that you have after the collapse of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, and the emergence of the European Union and European community in its current term. So in this period, I think there's two dynamics which impacted a lot EU-Iran relation. First is what is called a critical dialogue. That was an idea that raised in around 1992, and that was a series of discussions between Iran and Europe that was engaged in a closed-door discussions that was about talking about their differences, to show what each other is concerned about, and to resolve the problems based on the dialogue. So you have a period of a critical dialogue starting in 1992, last at least around 3 years, and effectively contributed to the resolving some of these problems that I mentioned throughout the 80s between Iran and Europe. At the same time, you have this dynamic of improved trade and economic cooperation between Europe and Iran. And that's because of the new Iranian government of Hashemi Rafsanjani in the 90s. That was, the agenda was about reconstruction. Remember, Iran is coming out of the war, of 8 years of the war with Iraq, so it needs reconstruction, it needs economic, let's say, revival. And Europe is seen as somewhere that can provide capital, that can provide technology, and that can provide a sort of a trade partnership. And that's why these two tracks, political dialogue and critical dialogue, and the economic interests of the both sides, and by the way, for the European economies, Iran was a big country without any competitor, the market was there, and Europe saw an interest to get in. So you see this period of, let's say, getting closer because of two factors. However, there were problems still, like the incident of 1995, that was the murder of Iranian dissidents, which was famous for its Mykonos court, which is basically where Iranian intelligence officers killed some of their diaspora, which were against, obviously, the revolution. And as a result, the European countries all took back their ambassadors, and there was a huge political crisis. So, however, 1997 and the new elections in Iran, Khatami at that time was the president, coming as a reformist who is seeking to change the perception of the world from Iran, and as a result is a new opening to the Europe. So what happens is that critical dialogue that I mentioned improved to what they call comprehensive dialogue. That comprehensive dialogue includes between Europe and Iran three baskets: on international issues, which was talking about terrorism, non-proliferation issues, and many areas of mutual concern. Cooperation areas, which were about the economy, trade, and many of areas that might be a joint interest for both sides. And regional issues, like Palestine and Israel, Iran's support of the Lebanese groups, and other areas. So basically, what we see in the 1990s between Iran and Europe is that the critical dialogue evolved into the comprehensive dialogue and basically opened a new area of cooperation between Europe and Iran. Despite whatever happens, despite that political standoff that happened over the killing of the Iranians in Europe and the problem of, always criticism over the double standards by the Iranian side. So what happens here is that this comprehensive dialogue was going to result into a comprehensive agreement between Iran and Europe in 2002. So basically in 2002, there was an initiative by the European side to sign a comprehensive agreement, a cooperation agreement, trade agreement with Iran that included many areas of cooperation. However, the assessment of the European side was that the reformist government in Iran will continue. So this assessment was not that much precise. Obviously, as you may probably heard of, the Iranian government changed and Ahmadinejad came to power in 2004. So basically, European calculation that the reformists in Iran will remain in power and they can sign the cooperation and trade agreement with Iran a bit later was not accurate. And why Europeans, they wanted to sign this agreement a bit later? Because of the nuclear crisis. Because in 2003, first IAEA resolution on Iran came out, and it was discovered that Iran has a secret nuclear activity which was handled by the IAEA. So what I want to say is that, as you see, while there was a critical dialogue and discussions over comprehensive dialogue, Iranians in secret were doing the nuclear activities and was not revealing to Europe what they are doing. So this already created a sort of mistrust. On the other side, the Iranian critics inside the country were arguing that what Europe is doing with Iran is basically, again, trying to support the American narrative, because the Europe, through the reformists inside Iran, want to change the revolution. That was what many conservatives in the Iranian establishment were thinking. They were thinking that this cooperative agreement, comprehensive cooperative agreement with Iran, is a motive to change the regime inside Iran and make Iran less antagonistic against the United States. So basically, as you see, the reading of each other's motives were completely different. While for Europe, this agreement was a show of a good gesture to build a relation with Iran. For part of the intellectual, part of the elite groups inside Iran, that agreements and cooperation was intended to regime change. It's important to remember that this complexity is increased by the nuclear issue. Basically, the nuclear issue changed the whole EU-Iran dynamic of relations after 2003. Europe here probably has taken one of its first major diplomatic efforts, which basically shaped for years the European diplomacy, and that was the Iran nuclear talks. E3, at that time Britain, France, and Germany, led a very extensive dialogue with Iran over its nuclear capability. We're talking about 2003. During the time that the United States was against the dialogue, basically what happened on the European side was that Europe was completely in contradiction with the United States over its Iran policy. While the Bush administration at that time, probably many of you heard about the Iraq War and the Swiss victory over Iraq, was very much in favor of probably having another war in the Middle East by attacking Iran. Europe has had a completely different understanding of the Middle East. For Europe, it was diplomacy. It was going to solve the issue through the extensive diplomatic act, and that's where the Iran nuclear negotiations start. Europe basically preceded that, put a lot of effort on it, and it succeeded at some point. It succeeded in a sense that it managed to create a new norm. It managed to contain the US from going to the military or non-diplomatic way, despite the failure of reaching an agreement before 2006, which the first time is Iran's nuclear file goes to the Security Council. What managed by Europe was that they created a procedure. They created a procedure that procedure was against a military action. So diplomacy prevailed over the military action by the European effort. So to make it short, The JCPOA, which probably is a joint, is Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, which was the end of this cycle of a nuclear discussion with Iran and Europe and other countries, was signed in 2015. The deal was a comprehensive answer to whatever challenge Iran nuclear program was posing to the non-proliferation argument. Deal probably was one of the best diplomatic conflict resolution, let's say, efforts ever done in the international security arena. It's one of the pillars of a non-proliferation argument. It supports the whole global non-proliferation architecture, and that was the European intention. Well, it was signed in 2015. And Europe benefited a lot from that. And basically, that beneficiary was not just the diplomatic and normative, but also economic, because as a result, the US sanctions on Iran were taken, and European companies were given the opportunity to, were given the possibility. So it was useful because at least those of you who were sleeping waked up. That was a good point. Okay, so we understood what was that. So, this diplomatic victory basically had an economic front too. It led the European countries to enter Iran because the US secondary sanction was removed. And as a result, Europe became a main economic partner, once again, a main economic partner of Iran after 2015 until 2019, when the deal is, when the United States withdraw from the deal, and basically that's the moment that a very complex discussion starts. And that is about the fact that how Europe managed the US decision to exit from the international accord. So the US effort was basically, strategically, was intended to dismantle the JCPOA. The Trump policy, Trump believed that JCPOA was not a good deal. He was miscalculating the fact that he can have a better deal, so he get out of the deal. However, the European effort basically was quite critical because they remained part of the deal, and Iran remained part of the deal. So the events of 2018 and 2019, where Europe still had a commitment under international accord, which is a JCPOA, and Iran also has a commitment, becomes a very important period of European diplomatic effort. Because basically, it's a case study that shows how European strategic autonomy can work. It shows how Europe can protect its own interests or its products of its policies, notwithstanding the fact that it might have different policy issues with one of its allies, which in this case is the United States. But unfortunately, Europeans did a lot on that, but eventually they were not successful. They created a tool which was called Instex to protect Iranian interests from the deal. The Instex did not work. So basically, this led to a sort of a framework that we still have it as a JCPOA, but it's not working. So let me summarize this dimension. And then I aim my argument because I want to have some time for discussion. So I tried to summarize the points on political events, but I hope that has not caused you frustration because a lot of information and sometimes might not be so easy to capture also. But this more important part is this last point that I'm saying. So this political dimension, as we said, we had the social layer, we had the trade layer, and then we have a political layer. This political layer gives several areas of perception too. First is a perception of Europe as a balancing power. For Iranians, Europe is a balancing power. So basically, what I mean by balancing power is that in international relations, you always need to play and hedge between different actors. So basically, while there are always a concept of alliance, which means that you have constant allies or constant partners that you have a vital strategic interest with. But at the same time, you're facing with an environment that you don't have necessarily an alliance, which is in the case of Iran, but you need to play between the actors. And that play between actors means sometimes changing the balance and moving from working with one actor to working with another actor. This hedging the strategy, this balancing act, is a tradition of Iran foreign policy. Let me give you an example. For example, when Portuguese invaded the Strait of the Hormuz Island in 1507, what Iranian did was that they were military weak. What Iranian did was that they went and they started to talk with Britain. They made a deal with Britain, which is one of the first interesting episodes of the British-Portuguese diplomacy, because that Iranian-British deal rejected a very famous Windsor Treaty, which was between Britain and Portugal. So basically, Britain betrayed Portugal because it came to support Iran to free the island of Hormuz. Why Britain did that? There are a lot of calculations over there. So basically, this type of play in international relation, which you use the resources or assets of another country to balance with another one, is what we call balancing. In the Iranian history, there are a lot of that, and Iranians are experts on doing that, playing with actors. So another big example is the Great Game in early 20th century, which is a competition between Britain and Russia in the Middle East. And that competition, which is famous for the Great Game, again, Iran is one of the major actors in the sense that Iran played these actors against each other. So it played Britain against Russia, played Russia against Britain. So this sort of balancing is what Iran sees a value in doing politics with Europe. So for Iranians, Europe remains an important balancing partner. Perception of Europe through the lens of commitments. So, as I said throughout the argument, especially in that last part, which is about the JCPOA, Europe had a commitment under the JCPOA. Europe's commitment, what was the Europe commitment under the international court, which we call JCPOA, was that it safeguard trade with Iran, notwithstanding of US decision. Because on the Iranian side, Iran was promised that it will keep its nuclear activity under control of IAEA. So the commitments were mutual. So basically, I commit to you that I don't do any nuclear activity that you don't know, and you commit to me that you will not disrupt the commerce and trade with me. So each of us that broke the commitment will be treated differently. So what happened is that in 2019 onward, Europe failed to provide its commitments. Basically, Europe had to surrender because of many complexities, because of the complexity that private sector is not in Europe necessarily listening to the governments. Private sector is a private sector, so it does whatever is in interest for it. While there was a threat of a US sanction, so the European companies had to choose between working with the US or working with Iran and accepting the cost of the US sanction. So they choose obviously to work with the United States. And as a result, in a diplomatic way, basically Europe was not able to provide its commitment. Here is an important concept for international relations. You cannot make commitments when you don't have tools to do that commitment. So if you're a European state, if you're an Iranian state, you make commitments based on the tools and resources that you control. Otherwise, if you do the agreements or go to the commitments that you cannot meet, you will remain a sort of non-reliable partner. So basically, one perception of Europe in Iran is this unreliability or lack of provision of commitment. Europe provides commitments which at the end of the day cannot deliver. Perception of Europe through conflict resolution lens. Remember, as I said, one of JCPOA and nuclear talks was one of the most important achievements of European diplomacy in the last 2 decades. Basically, it was one of the key areas that showed the relevancy of Europe as a player in international security. Why? Because Europe was managed to prevent the war which was not a normal war, could have been a regional war in the Middle East. This is what we are now fearing because of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict right now. This could have happened 20 years before between the United States and Iran. Europe diplomacy managed to contain this. Europe managed through facilitation, through putting huge diplomatic efforts, to find an alternative solution, which here you have a lot of diplomatic innovations, putting a lot of resources, which was done by the European states, and particularly E3 and European External Action Service. So they provided a lot of resources that managed and create a shape or image of Europe as a conflict resolution actor. As an actor that has a huge capacity in facilitation. Facilitation of a dialogue between, let's say, conflicting actors. The next understanding is, as I mentioned, the sense of mistrust. Because each of the sides, as I said during those incidents of the killing of the Iranians in Europe, why there was a critical dialogue between Iran and Europe, or the sense of the nuclear issue which was emerged while Iran and Europe were in the discussion over cooperation agreement. So these created a sort of mistrust. So basically the perception of mistrust is again one area of perception of Iran over Europe. And then and then I end up here. The last area is the sense of the last layer is a security layer. The security layer is again quite complicated. Just very briefly, go back to history. Iran-Europe history has moments which actually Iran lost land because of single-state policies at some time. For example, as I mentioned, Portuguese invasion in 1905 Iranian islands, and then two famous agreements which again facilitated by Britain, which is Smith mediation in 1863 and loss of Herat, part of today's Afghanistan, which is 1857. So basically Iran lost part of its eastern geography, which is today a country of Afghanistan, due to the British mediation and British intervention in one way or another. So there is a sense of history there. And then there is the Iran-Iraq War, which is a very important episode of Iranian contemporary history. And the Iran-Iraq War was an important case because basically while Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, and the perception of Iranians was that Europe is going to condemn the Saddam attack, not only Europeans did not condemn the Saddam attack, but they started to providing Saddam with weapons and arms. Basically, it's very interesting that episode, that the chemical weapon that was used by Saddam Hussein against Iran was provided by European countries and European companies. Well, there's an argument that if there's an involvement of state, or these are illegal trade of the weapons, this is an argument that we always have in a non-proliferation discussion. But one of the critical episodes that remains in the minds of the Iranians is the European policy during the Iran-Iraq War. And that links to our today issues, because if you go back to Iran's support of Russia, you may find some connections. That how probably Iranians might see this as a moment that show to Europe that you cannot support whatever policies. So here we have four perceptions again, very fast. Perception of Europe through transatlantic alliance. For Iran, Europe, as I said, is linked with the United States. So Europe's security activities is conceived through the NATO perspective. And the NATO is seen as part of that broader European tool that might impact Iran's security environment. Perception of Europe as an arms dealer, we need to remember that Europe is still one of the major actors and arms dealer in the Persian Gulf region, to the Saudi Arabia, to the Emirates, to the other GCC countries, and perception of Europe as a threat to state stability. Here, this is again an important case, and that is about Europe's official adaptation of maximum pressure, which we know, which is basically what has happened after the 2020 and 2021 incidents, which, as I said, it was a withdrawal of U.S. from the war from the JCPOA, and Europe's criticism of Iran's defense strategy, which is about what we were talking about, missile and non-proliferation issues. So, my last points, and I know that I think I talked a bit too much, but when we talk about perception, we need to always remember the multi-layered nature of this perception, usually among the states, and this multi-layered complexity is causing out of matter. I mentioned 4 layers, and as you saw, in each layer there are 2, 3, 4 variables that are shaping the perception, and some of them are contradictory, which basically is interesting because when you try to analyze one policy, your analysis might be correct based on one perception of the country that you're studying, but might not be correct by the other perception. And this is exactly why there is usually between states misperception and miscalculation takes place. Something that then, if we have time, we will discuss. The arms control or conflict resolution mechanisms comes into the fore to discuss this. So I stop here, and I hope that I have not made you so much tired, and because I talked more than what I wanted to talk, but let's have a discussion, and I think we have 10, 15 minutes, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so the floor is yours. Yes. Can you introduce yourself as usual first? Yes.
Hi, my name is Olga. I'm from Belarus, and maybe that is why I want to ask this question. So you see how many young people are leaving their country of political situation. So, and you see now Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and so on. And all these guys are brilliant brains for their countries. So, your point is your background, how to stop it. Thank you.
So, what if we go and the next one, please, and then I answer 2, 3 questions. Yeah, I think it was.
Thank you. My name is Julia, and I'm from the Netherlands. And I had a question in light of the recent surveys by KMAN, the group for analyzing and measuring attitudes in Iran. Because there's, of course, like a discrepancy between the government and between what the Iranians want and how they view governance. How do you think this instability, especially in light of the recent protests, will influence the Iranian perception of Iran, both on a governmental level and on the general population? Thank you.
Okay, so maybe I start engaging. Oh, it seems I should not touch this at all. So until you may come up with other 2 questions. So, I mean, Olga, your question is quite a complex one. I mean, basically, very much interlinked the 2 points that you raised, because as you might see in my argument also, there is a sort of a division between the state and societies in these countries. What as you mentioned, there is a level of analysis at the social level which sees Europe positive, and Europe as a source of fascination. But on the other side, there is a level of argument at the state which sees Europe as a threat and as a security threat. So this mismatch of state and society, you can go ahead on various areas, on various social and economic dimensions. So my answer is that while there is a problem on the social contract, which basically means a sort of agreement between state and society, which they agree on some certain terms, if there is not this social contract, or if there is this, let's say, a requirement to revise that, what state wants and what people want, and how they can have a dialogue with each other. I think without this, you will continue to have young generation are getting out from their countries because they don't find the chance, not a chance of transmitting what they want to the government, not seeing any possibility to engage with their government. So basically, political reform and revision of this, let's say, expired sort of social contract is what most of these countries are needed. But the problem is exactly arise from here. This many of us may know, but what mostly people are disagreeing is the fact that when you are facing with complex societies like Iran, like Russia, these are very complex societies. So these very complex societies, transformation cannot take place in a short period of time. We're dealing with histories and we're dealing with the long-term perspectives. I think the solution is not short-term. I think the solution is not forcing hardliner positions in each of these countries. Many of external interventions, unfortunately, were not constructive. Rather, it basically reinforced the conservative forces in these countries. So basically, that needs, from my understanding, a very renewed discussion, maybe by those who are outside these countries, of what the meaning of intervention is and what intervention looks like from external powers for these countries for their better. Well, for example, I see, now I switch to the argument that you said, is what I see, for example, in Iranian diaspora during the last 1 year is very interesting. It's in a space that basically you're trying to see some sort of debate to argue that what would be the future of the country, but unfortunately still it's a very, very preliminary stage. So basically the way toward the transformation of these states passes from formation of a strong opposition, or let's say reformist movements, that they're able to have a dialogue inside themselves. However, many of these groups are not necessarily able to have a democratic dialogue among themselves. So basically, again, this is another factor that makes this process rather than a moment. You know, we're discussing about a process of evolution. We're talking about a process of a transformation. And this process of transformation, we need to remember, takes years and takes decades. And unfortunately, I think no one has any clear-cut, immediate solution as a way to transform these societies. But what I can argue is that, which is basically bringing it to our discussion today, is that one of the open discussions for Europe is that how it can engage with a sort of a policy inside these countries that can construct or can positively impact this reform process rather than negatively impact that. At the European level, many of these arguments so far have not necessarily, for example, the argument of sanction, just give you an example, might be interesting because from some of the proponents of the sanction, that's a political tool, so you don't wage a war, because you cannot wage a war with Russia directly, you cannot wage a war with Iran directly. They are regional global powers, they can cause you a lot of conflict, so you engage with them in a way, coercive political way, through the sanction. But then the next question is that, what this sanction causes? I mean, these sanctions, unfortunately, the only immediate cause of these sanctions is the reinforcement of the part of the elites inside those countries which are seeking the status quo, because it reinforces the threat environment. And when you have a threat environment bigger, you have those establishments, which are the security establishment, which are the military and so forth and so on, that becomes more powerful. So basically, it forces a creative resistance movements that at the end of the day, not only will not encourage any transformation mechanism, but it basically blocks the chance of any transformation. So part of our argument comes back to the European level. Let's relook our tools that we used, and we know that they were not constructive. Let's look at the experience of Trump that get out the international court, its policy caused that now Iran is basically a nuclear power, a nuclear weapon, it's just 2 weeks from the moment that there is a political decision. And the result was a simply complete eradication of reformist political groups or elites inside Iranian politics, because it reinforced the argument of those who are seeking for status quo. So part of our argument goes back to how we can see our own policies inside Europe, in Europe. I hope that, because at some point I just forgot your question, I hope that I have answered that. So please, if anyone wants to intervene. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Edoardo. I live here in Turin, and my question is a bit off topic. I wanted to ask you if, in your opinion, there is a serious possibility that of an Iranian intervention in the Palestinian conflict, and what may be the consequences of such action.
Any more questions, please? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Laura, I'm from Spain, and I wanted to ask you because if I understood it properly, you were talking about the transatlantic alliance of the Europe security activities and the NATO and stuff, and I wanted to ask you, is this transatlantic alliance linked with the perspective of the Europe as supporter of the American perspective, or it's more like a transatlantic alliance in another point of view?
Okay, so let me take these two. The first, Eduardo, I mean, yeah, that's an interesting concern. So basically, I just deliberately didn't enter to daily political issues in this session because I thought it was better we go to more, as I explained. So one of the very conflicting points now between Europe and Iran is their support of the two sides of the conflict. Iran supports obviously the Palestine and Hamas, and Europe supports obviously Israel, of course, and we know that the European politics is also complex on this issue. But the fact is that I think there is a sort of understanding among regional powers, including Iran, and the global powers, including the United States and even Israel, that expansion of the war is basically what none of these actors are looking for. Basically, Iranians have already arrived and achieved what they wanted to achieve. And that was a simple thing. You know, Israelis, at least for 3-4 years, were imagining a very simplistic understanding of the strategic cost on Iran. And that simplistic understanding, which is, by the way, a very interesting argument that how Israeli intelligence and establishment did not realize this fact, was linking to the argument that they were assuming that by inflicting tactical costs, like, for example, Iran produced hundreds of drones per year, by hitting one small factory somewhere and disrupting a production of 20 drones, Iranians will change their mind and they will say, oh, it was a very threatful issue. Or by killing of a scientist that might took 15 years to kill him, and Fakhrizadeh, Iranian scientist, was killed by Israelis. He was already under presidential level of protection for 15 years. Finally, Mossad killed him, but fine. Iranians were ready for that. They knew that one day he might be killed. But the assessment in Mossad and this Israeli establishment was that these tactical costs will lead to a strategic decision. So this level of miscalculation, I think the Iranian objective in the whole idea was that, look, first, Iran can respond. Second is that Israeli deterrence is not as it used to be viewed or as it tries to be showed to the others. So on the strategic level, I think Iran has achieved what it wanted to achieve with this Israel-Palestine conflict. So what it means that for Iranians, there is not that much interest to expand the conflict, because from now on the conflict is a cost. You already arrived to what you wanted to arrive. For Americans, somehow it's a similar argument. For Americans, they argue that let's control the damage, because already we received the damage. If the war expands, and if there are multiple fronts against Israel, then, first of all, we need to engage, because Israel cannot do it alone. And second, there is the risk that really we cannot, end up in a... You always can have a military victory like what you did in Iraq, but you necessarily, on a strategic long term, you cannot stabilize after the military operation. So from the American side, there is this fear that this expansion might cause to a long-term instability in the whole Eastern Mediterranean, and obviously we're talking about Eastern Mediterranean, it's not so far from Europe. We're talking about a broader region. We're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Egypt, we're talking about Syria, Iraq, Iran, and then the GCC countries. So how then you can stabilize the region? So for Americans, it's a big question. That's why. So what I'm going to say is that big powers and regional powers, for Russians, there's a similar assessment. Russians are concerned that any expansion can cause their power in the Mediterranean, in the Syria, less, because Russia now doesn't have the resources to devote there. If Americans come there, they may remain there. So Russia will lose its influence in the Syria and Israel for at least for a decade. So basically, you see, there's a convergence of interest here. What I want to say is that I hope at a strategy level, this convergence of interest prevents the actors from going too much. So basically, at least so far what I see, you have skirmishes in the Lebanese front, in Yemen, but they are more restoration of deterrence. This is what militarily we call. So basically, you fire a missile not just because you want to go to the war, but because you want to show that you have the capability to still fire a missile. So this is a restoration of deterrence. This is not necessarily a military operation. And Israelis are doing that bombardment, limited strikes, because again, they want to also restore deterrence. So this is a strategic level. However, the risk is that there's a cycle of escalation. So you do the restorations, but there is one point that what we were discussing today. There is miscalculation. There is not a precise assessment that what was the intention of this operation. This intention was intended to a bigger thing, or it was just a restoration of deterrence. So because military is a problem to understand these complexities, there's a huge risk of escalation. So what I see from things is that strategic level, all actors want to damage control, want to not expand the situation at the moment, but the risk of escalation is serious because at the tactical level they cannot manage, and remember, Iranian proxies are not the ones that are directly controlled by a phone from Tehran. They're independent, autonomic actors, and they will sometimes decide on the things that may not be necessarily what Tehran thinks. So the risk is there. What you said on the EU-NATO thing, I think, well, yes, what I mentioned was that Iranian perception is that EU is not an independent security actor. EU functions under the umbrella of US security architecture. In Europe, the US security architecture is NATO. So basically, when engaged with Europe, Europe has no security autonomy, and as a result, it may easily slip over to a sort of policies that might threaten Iranian security policy. For example, one major issue that was the last point that I mentioned very quickly, and that was about missile issue. For example, the argument about Iranian missile is basically a US argument, because that US argument is transformed into the European argument, notwithstanding the fact that from inside Europe there is a very few threat perception regarding a possible use of Iranian missile against Europe. Iranian missiles are not even toward Europe for a long time. Now things might change, but they were directed toward the NATO bases. So that's the complexity here. NATO is part of Europe, but Iran doesn't want to have a war with Europe. But at the same time, see EU, basically, in a broader term, part of it. And remember that before the war in Ukraine, despite having said that, before the war in Ukraine, NATO and EU were two separate institutions. They had strategic points which are not convergence. So basically, the EU-NATO summit or working group was a more limited concept. Now, after the war in Ukraine, you see a more closer EU-NATO strategic posture. And that's exactly what Iran is concerned. So basically, from the Iranian perspective, there is a convergence of EU-NATO at a strategic level. So basically, we won't have any independent strategically European security policy. It's a security policy under the NATO, and the security policy under the NATO means the American security policy. So I think we have very few time.
No, yes, we're running out of time. So yes, so thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.